Welcome, one and all, to the Hammer Territory Podcast. My name is Sean Coleman. Hope wherever you are and wherever you are listening, you have had a wonderful week. Of course, the playoffs, we're past the first round of the playoffs. Plenty to talk about when it comes to baseball in general. But unfortunately, the Braves, while they're not in the playoffs, that doesn't mean there isn't plenty to talk about when it comes to the Braves. Obviously, the news got added to this week with the end of Brian Snitker's tenure as Braves manager. We'll talk about the latest when it comes to the Braves manager position, plus some roster moves as the Braves look to clean up their roster and some early offseason roster decisions beyond the ones that the Braves have already made. That and much more on this edition of the Hammer Territory Podcast. And of course, I've got one of the best in the business when it comes to talking Braves, my podcast partner, Stephen Tolbert. Stephen, good as always to have you, sir. Hope you're well.
What's up, buddy? Yeah, man, Friday night show. We don't do many Friday night shows, but obviously off-season mode has begun. And so, this might be a couple that we do throughout the winter. But yeah, some things to talk about. Obviously, the big news happened on Wednesday with Brian Snitker stepping down as manager and taking a new position in the front office. And we've gotten a little, tidbits of news here and there since then. The reason we waited until Friday to record is we thought Alex Anthopoulos would do his end of season press conference so that we could react to that. That's kind of what we thought was going to happen today. We had heard behind the scenes that it might happen. It did not happen, obviously. So that'll be next week, but still some things have dropped that we're going to talk about. The Braves did make a series of roster moves, kind of a one big chunk of roster moves that matter. We're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of that. So yeah, just kind of in off-season mode and in kind of find a new manager mode.
Absolutely. And, the thing that I'll say is this, is that when it comes to, the Braves, typically we get the Alex Anthopoulos, end of the year presser. It's been in the playoffs for many years in a row. This time around, though, maybe he's just delayed it a bit just to give Brian Snitker, his proper time to, everybody really to cherish, and enjoy Snitker through the weekend. And then next week, business will pick up, not in terms of more rosters decisions and, off-season moves, but just in terms of at some point next week, early next week, I imagine we'll be able to get more insight from Alex Anthopoulos. But let's talk about what now is one of the bigger offseason needs for the Braves, and that's finding a new manager. We talked on Wednesday about several potential names that could make sense. Nothing has happened on the front of, again, probably out of respect for Snitker through the weekend, nothing has happened yet, at least through reports of the Braves showing any type of interest in anybody as of yet. But one thing that we do know is that we could start scratching some potential names off the list, and one name is Skip Schumaker. Now, many had mentioned Skip Schumaker as a potential candidate for the Braves opening. I feel that was much more just a general connection with the fact that Skip Schumaker probably was the most buzzworthy managerial candidate out there of all the potential ones that, could potentially be pursued by teams this offseason. But it always seemed like when Bruce Bochy was not returning to the Rangers from earlier this week, Skip Schumaker, former manager of the Marlins, former manager of the year, now at the Rangers, he was the natural pivot for the Rangers. And while that hasn't been made official yet, it certainly seems like that's the case. In other words, Skip Schumaker is one significant name that you can likely scratch off the list of potential candidates for the Braves job.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the more unlikely candidates just because he was on the Ranger staff last year. He was very much the kind of coach in waiting, the manager in waiting. Bruce Bochy was almost certainly going to move on after this year, one way or the other. So, I think Skip Schumaker took that job in Texas, knowing that he would eventually be the manager. I think they even hired his old bench coach from Miami. I think his old bench coach from Miami was on that staff as well. So, like, all signs pointed to him taking that job. And then one of their beat writers came out today and said they're not even looking at external candidates. So, and if you're not going to look at external candidates right now, which is the time to do it, then that probably means you're not going to at all. So, yeah, you can kind of cross his name off the list. There were a couple more that are a little more interesting, but Skip always felt like a long shot, and the news we got today kind of confirms that.
The
You're
thing that I'll say
muted.
is this: I was not. I got you. I got
You
you that
got
time.
it. You got it.
The thing that I'll say is that yes, it definitely seems as if the idea of Skip Schumacher being the Braves manager was not, really something that seemed likely. But I mean, again, from the national, news writers, they're going to look in any way, shape, or form to take the most buzzworthy name and make their story up as much as they possibly can. As a matter of fact, as we are recording this, it has been made official. Jeff Passan just coming across on X announcing that the Texas Rangers have hired Skip Schumacher as their next manager. So it's official. One of the more connected names, at least by national media, to the Braves job is no longer on the table. So nothing really lost there. It's not as if, again, as Stephen mentioned, this is a big loss because it didn't seem that, likely to begin with. But I do think something else that's worth noting is, what coaches, and especially those coaches that have been connected with Alex Anthopoulos in the past, as they potentially, if they have current jobs in the majors, as they potentially, part ways with their current teams, how could they figure into the equation? One notable name is John Gibbons. John Gibbons, who is a former two-time, he managed the Toronto Blue Jays on two separate occasions, the latter of which was through much of Alex Anthopoulos' latter part of his time with the Toronto Blue Jays. There obviously is a significant connection between him and Alex Anthopoulos. Now, does that mean that I think that John Gibbons immediately becomes John Gibbons was the Mets bench coach? He parted ways with the organization today. Does this mean that he moves up to the top of the list as one of the most likely candidates for the job? I personally don't think so. I think it at least means that he'll get an interview. And it could mean that as other openings come in the Braves organizations, when it comes to scouting, when it comes to coaches, things like that, he could take on one of those roles. I don't necessarily think that he'll be a serious candidate for the managerial role. But Stephen, the reason that I mention this is because while we're talking about the manager's role, there are other spots on this Braves coaching staff, other spots in the organization that are likely going to change hands as well as the Braves really try to, kind of redo the organizational focus. Names that can become available that have connections with Anthopoulos, like Gibbons, it's going to be worth watching those names to see if they take on a role with the Braves, even if it's not as manager over time.
Yeah, so John Gibbons was the manager for Toronto. He was actually, I didn't realize this till a couple of days ago. He actually had two separate stints as the manager for the Blue Jays. One in kind of the early 2000s, like 2002 to 2008. And then he did the stint with Alex Anthopoulos, was the GM from 2013 to 2018, I think. So he obviously, he and Alex have a long working relationship. He's been the Mets bench coach for the last 3 seasons, 2023, 2024, and 2025. He's a baseball guy. He's been around baseball his whole life. And again, he's got a prior relationship with Alex. I'm guessing, he kind of stepped down from the Mets job. He didn't technically get fired. He kind of said, I'm kind of walking away. You never know what's really going on behind the scenes there. But like you said, offline, he might have seen the writing on the wall, but I would guess he gets an interview. At the very least, again, he knows Alex. Alex knows him. He's respected. He's been around the game. He's been in the NL East. Like, he checks a lot of boxes. I'm not going to pretend like I, was watching a ton of Toronto Blue Jays baseball, a decade ago. So I can't tell you a ton about him, but I would guess he gets an interview. And I will say this about not hearing a lot of news. I imagine this search is going to go the same way that like free agent possibilities go, where we're not going to hear anything. The only time you're going to hear something is when it's done. So I wouldn't expect a lot of updates, at least, like out in terms of being reported by national outlets or beat writers. We might get a snit, some little crumb of information. One benefit we have of being in this position is we do know people kind of behind the scenes. We do have some connections. We hear stuff. Doesn't mean we can always repeat it. We're not everything we hear is reportable or we're allowed to say it, but we hear little things here and there. But I would expect a ton of, some organizations, you get to track every move they make second by second because everything gets leaked. The Braves are not like that, and I don't expect the manager search to be like that either.
Absolutely, and I think that that's again, just something that Alex Anthopoulos puts value on. It he feels that that is a leverage move, and more often than not, I know here recently it may not seem that way, but more often than not, it has worked out. One other final thought, another piece of news that came across today was Chipper Jones actually went on to, I believe it was 92.9 The Game. He had a conversation, and of course they brought up the Braves manager's opening, and it looks as if Chipper's stance has changed a little bit when it comes to his viewpoint on his potential future in coaching. Now he says his family's okay with him managing. It doesn't seem as if Chipper's stance has changed that much. It doesn't seem like managing maybe in his future, but he does think he would make a really good hitting coach. That certainly is noteworthy. It's not far-fetched to see Chipper as a potential hitting coach because we have seen plenty of former notable names, Hall of Famers, anywhere from Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire down to John Mabry, just many different levels of former major leaguers who have been hitting coaches. So maybe that is a role. Chipper has had, kind of assistant type roles like that in the past. I mentioned that because we also saw former Brave Kurt Suzuki, who is a special assistant in the Angels organization, which we know has a lot of connection with the Braves. He interviewed for the Giants opening. So, Stephen, I'll ask you this question. We talked about it on Wednesday, how it really seems as if with where the Braves are and where they're trying to go, someone with past manager's experience makes sense, and a former player makes sense. But when it comes to Alex Anthopoulos, you also have these connections that really seem to, he loves to bring in former players of his into the organization. Do you give any type of value to there? We know that there won't be a lot of news out there about what potentially could happen. Does that mean you could see the Braves going with an outside of the common realm of thought option, a former player of Alex Anthopoulos's who could, despite not having a coaching past, be the option for the Braves?
Yeah, I would be surprised. I would be very surprised if Alex A went with somebody who's never managed before, and B went with somebody who's never managed before and has not ever really been a coach on any consistent level to be the manager. Now, like with Chipper, and that Chipper interview today was very interesting because he has changed his stance. Before he said he had always said he is not interested in the time commitment it takes to be a full-time coach. Like there was conversation about him being the hitting coach before, and he's always said he's not interested in the time commitment because you got to be with the team every day for 7 months. And today he kind of changed that. He said his family's good with it. He would not be interested in being a manager, but he thinks he'd be a really good hitting coach. And that I perked my ears up at that because I know the Braves technically have a hitting coach right now in Tim Hires, but not, I mean, his name is certainly not written in pen. And we have gotten, because Alex has not done his end of season press conference, we have not gotten any kind of statement on like where Alex's mind is at with the rest of the coaching staff, because obviously when the head guy leaves, you could have turmoil up and down. It was definitely notable to me that Chipper went on radio and very publicly said, I'd be fine being the hitting coach. Because that is a change of stance from where it was a couple of years ago when he was asked. And he said he just wasn't interested in the time commitment. With a guy like Kurt Suzuki, I know Suzuki is a West Coast kind of Bay Area guy. He spent a ton of time with the A's. And he interviewed with the Giants. I'd be curious to, I don't know if the Braves will bring him in. Obviously, he has a history with the Braves. He played for the Braves. Alex knows him. So it wouldn't stun me. But again, just my personal opinion, I could be dead wrong about this. This is just me guessing. I would be very surprised if the Atlanta Braves hired their next manager as somebody who's never been a manager before or has never even really worked on a coaching staff before. Even if they played, being a coach and then being a manager are very different things. And it's just such an important job. The Braves are in the middle of a World Series window. This is not a rebuilding team. I don't know. I could be wrong. I could be dead wrong, but I'd be surprised if they went with somebody with zero managerial experience.
Agree completely. I think that managerial experience, the Braves again need someone who has proven to be successful relating to players, but also adding that value when it comes to things we discussed on Wednesday. The analytics mindset, in-game decisions, things such as that. I think that those are certainly two big traits that you would like to have seen past success in when it comes to a potential hire. But speaking of that, It's not just to us talking about former Braves when it comes to them potentially rejoining the organization in different roles. We've also got some former Braves, plenty of former Braves, in fact, to kind of track as the playoffs continue. And that leads us to, of course, we do this nearly every week. Actually, we do it every week, in which we talk about, some options when it comes to DraftKings. And specifically, what I'm mentioning is that we are sponsored today by the Pick Six app from DraftKings, the official daily fantasy partner of the NFL. Now, I'm sure as many of our listeners know, Pick Six is a fantasy type format, if you will, fantasy type format for the many different formats that are through DraftKings, where basically you can pick in most cases, over and under for different statistics when it comes to players. And you can rack them up or you can stack them up all the way through 6 players. And the more you get right, the better payout you get. So it's definitely a fun way to test your knowledge and luck when it comes to playing both fantasy and, your fun when it comes to gambling a bit as well. And Stephen, I think that it's a good time to talk about the DraftKings Pick Six because we got plenty of former Braves to pick from when it comes to the playoffs starting tomorrow. And 2 in particular are going to actually be facing off tomorrow. That is Dansby Swanson as well as William Contreras. Now, you made some picks here, Stephen. I think both William Contreras and Dansby Swanson are going to be critical components to a long postseason run for either the Brewers or the Cubs. Do you think either one of them start that success tomorrow?
Yeah, so we went with the Braves flavor for our Pick Six tonight. We went with, obviously, the Braves are not in the playoffs, but the Brewers versus the Cubs feature, some former Braves, and William Contreras was my Pick Six tonight. So it's, we went with more than 1.5 hits, runs, and RBIs. Contreras has been unbelievable since he left the Braves. He's been one of the best hitters in Milwaukee. Milwaukee was the best team in baseball this year. I don't think anybody had that coming. And Contreras sits in the middle of that lineup. It's going to be a home game for them. The Cubs rotation is kind of a mess right now. Kate Horton is on the IL. So I like William Contreras more than 1.5 hits, runs, and RBIs.
I definitely think that is a way to go when it comes to Pick Six. Of course, you got Freddie Freeman. You got so many different options, but the big key is, hey, you feel strong about certain players that you think are going to play pivotal roles in their team's playoff success. Make sure you pick them through the DraftKings Pick Six app. This season, play your player instincts. Download the DraftKings Pick Six app now and use code FOUL. That's code FOUL, F-O-U-L. Play just $5, get $50 in Pick Six bonus picks. Make the call, ride the upside in partnership with DraftKings Pick Six. The crown is yours. More in just a moment after another word from DraftKings.
Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org in Connecticut. Must be 18 and over. Age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick Six not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. 1 per new customer. Bonus awarded as non-withdrawable Pick Six bonus picks that expire in 14 days. Limited time offer. See terms at picksix.draftkings.com/promos.
I'll say this after having tried the Pick Six, option in the past. It can humble you real quickly, or it can make your day if you get it right. But speaking of a bit of a humbling news this past week as well, it wasn't the only significant occurrence this week when it came to news for the Braves, when it came to Brian Snitker's time as manager ending. There also was the beginning of what can only be described as a big roster cleanup coming for the Braves. Right now, the Braves have several decisions that they've got to make when it comes to the roster. And it's got to be early in the offseason because with so many potential needs out there, so many potential boxes that they need to check to improve, they've got to make sure that they've got the roster space to do that. And because of that, it was actually announced, I believe it was yesterday. It was announced yesterday that the Braves went ahead and made some decisions when it came to some notable Braves, but also some names who, it just made sense weren't likely to be with the club long. Of course, that's Luke Williams, Jarred Kelenic, Alexis Diaz, Dane Dunning, and Sandy Leone. Each of those players were outrighted from the 40-man roster. and many of them selected free agency. I believe all of them selected free agency. But before we get into the most notable name of that round of roster moves, I don't think any of this is surprising, Stephen. It was going to happen later in the offseason anyway. It seems like the Braves and these players, they didn't really come to the understanding. The Braves just went ahead and removed these players from the roster because these were names that were just not going to figure into the equation moving forward in 26 and beyond.
Yeah, so the Braves had so many injuries over the season that they had to do a lot of patchwork roster, maneuverability throughout the season. And what that meant was when we got to the end of the season, you were going to have necessary roster moves that have to take place because, and we've talked about this before, one thing to keep in mind is the Braves have 11 guys who are on the 60-day IL who have to be added back to the 40-man roster once the World Series is over. Well, you can't add 11 people to your 40-man roster until you clear 11 spots for your 40-man roster. And when the season ended, the Braves had a full 40-man roster plus an additional 11 guys on the 60-day IL. So they had effectively 51 players. So some roster cutting was coming. Even before the offseason begins, just to begin the offseason, a bunch of roster moves had to happen. And so the Braves outrighted, they announced they outrighted 5 guys. They outrighted Sandy Leon, Jarred Kelenic, Dane Dunning, Alexis Diaz, and Luke Williams. So the thing about all those guys is when you outright somebody, that means you put them on waivers. They went through the waiver process. They went unclaimed. And so the Braves could option them to Gwinnett. But a number of those players had more than 3 years of service time, which means they could reject the assignment to AAA and just elect free agency and move into free agency. And most of them did. Like Jarred Kelenic is the big name. He rejected the assignment. He is now a free agent. So essentially all of these players are now just off the Braves roster, out of the franchise. The 40-man now sits at 35. Again, they were at 40. They just outrighted 5 of these guys. And then on top of those 5 those 5 spots opening up, you're also going to have the 3 big free agents, which is Marcell Ozuna, Raciel Iglesias, and Charlie Morton, all come off the roster as well. So that's 3 more spots. So effectively, the Braves will they have to put 11 guys back on the roster. And as of now, they've opened up 8 spots. So there will still have to be more roster cutting coming. There's plenty of names, guys like Vidal Brujan, Eli White, even like Nick Allen. None of those guys have minor league options for next year. They might be at risk. Brett Wisely, Jake Fraley. There's a bunch of the kind of the fringe pitchers the Braves picked up along the way. There's plenty of names. So you'll see more roster cutting before we even get to the offseason part of the moves. The Braves are going to have to cut some more roster spots just to start the offseason.
And before we get further into that, we'll discuss a bit more of that in the third segment. I think it's also, worth noting, not really much to talk about because there wasn't much to talk about during his time as a Brave, but Jarred Kelenic, I think, is worth taking a second to, look further into. Because to be honest, he is one of the bigger misses of Alex Anthopoulos' time leading the Braves. Now, I won't say he's the biggest because, I don't really think that he was ever that significant of a piece, unfortunately, within, the Braves, looking to have success. It just was not there for Jarred Kelenic. I think that talent certainly is not the question. It's other things that have to be there for the talent to consistently show up. Of course, we know how creative the Braves went through, how much money they took on, money maneuvering they took on in order to bring in Jarred Kelenic to where they didn't have to pay, a high prospect price. But it just did not work out. You had the June of 2004. He stepped up and did really well in the leadoff spot after Ronnie went down in 2024. And then after that, it just was a downward spiral for Jarred Kelenic. This is obviously the right move. I think Jarred Kelenic will get another shot, but we are to the point to where that could be his last significant shot if he doesn't take advantage of it. So now, not thrilled to see that it didn't work out, but I do think that it is the right move. You simply cut your ties. Perhaps Kelenic can find success elsewhere, wishing the best, but this was the right move. An obvious miss, but the right move to move on from Kelenic.
Yeah, and listen, the writing was on the wall when they signed Profar. I mean, they already had Acuna and Harris, and then they signed a full-time outfielder to play the same position that Kelenic plays, which is left field. Now, Kelenic was always going to get a tryout basically in the first 2 months of the year until Acuna came back in 2025. And he got that opportunity, and he was miserably bad. I mean, he's not the only reason the Braves offense was so bad early in the year, but like the fact that I mean, I don't know if people remember, but like him and Brian De La Cruz were like full-time outfielders for a minute there because Profar was on the suspended list for 80 games and Acuna was out with the ACL. And so the Braves were starting De La Cruz and Jarred Kelenic for like 2 months. And
Verdugo.
they couldn't. Oh, and Verdugo. Yeah, they had a bunch of them.
He when it comes to Steven Tolbert, Verdugo is he who shall not be named. So.
Yeah, exactly. And so, the writing was on the wall for Kelenic. And then he went down to AAA and was somehow even worse. Like he had a worse year in AAA than he did with the Braves, this year or last year. He had like a 500 OPS in AAA. And so, the Braves were going to owe him like $3 million if they tendered him a contract. There was not a chance. Even if he didn't elect free agency in this process, he would have been non-tendered at some point in the offseason. So this was always going to end with Jarred Kelenic being off the roster. And yeah, I mean, he's at a cross. I mean, I don't even know if he'll get a minor league deal, and he might be hit. Yeah. I mean, he might be in like Korea or in the Mexican League, or, he might have to go somewhere else for a couple of years and figure out how much he wants to play baseball. There are all sorts of reports about him, like not really giving it his all in AAA. We never confirmed any of that. I don't know how true that is, but it's just stuff we heard that he was very disinterested in being there. And his numbers certainly reflected it. So yeah, it didn't work. The Braves spent a pretty good chunk of change, about $18, $20 million and all the dead money and all the contracts they took on to get him. They didn't pay any prospects, thankfully. It was just money. But for that one season that they took him on, it was a big chunk of their available money. So it wasn't just completely free. And so, yeah, this has been one of Alex's kind of more notable big misses, and it's going to happen. But yeah, he crashed and burned. There's no other way to say it. He was terrible. Still got a lot of talent, but you never saw it because he just played horribly. He just couldn't hit, couldn't get on base, striking out like 35% of the time. It was just a disaster. So yeah, the Braves were always going to move on.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing that stands out is that the Braves are kind of noted again, as we mentioned plenty of times on this podcast. They have a good track record for, as Kevin Pillar, last week mentioned, just because it's just a great atmosphere that you want to succeed in. If you can't do it here, I'm not saying it can't be done elsewhere, but with the Braves track record of being able to have, especially position players, perform better here than they had in previous stops, in recent times in their career, it kind of stands out when they can't unlock the potential in a player. So wish Kelenic all the best, but again, it was the right decision for the Braves. But speaking of decisions, this is just the first round of decisions that are going to be made. When we come back, I'm going to talk with Steven about some important decisions when it comes to which guy do you want to go with to fill this needed area of depth, because the Braves are going to have to make some decisions on some similar type players on the roster to bring back all of their injured players in the coming weeks. More on that in just a moment after another word from our partners.
Okay, AJ, our slab pack ripping continues. Now, you just ripped a card that I think you're actually going to keep.
I am. I'm going to keep it. It's a Ken Griffey Jr. rookie card. The old, isn't this the famous Upper Deck one? I believe it is. And yeah, heck yeah, I'm going to keep it because I'm going to get Griffey to sign it. I'm going to get him to send it to me, which you can do, and I'm going to get Griffey to sign it, and it's only going to make it worth more. So I am all in on this card. I am keeping it, and it is one of the coolest cards with the highest turtleneck you've ever seen and the gold chain around his neck.
Graded 9, 1989 Upper Deck. You get the offer for $179. It's valued at around $199. And you're like, nah, I'm keeping it. But if you wanted to sell it back instantly, you can. It's the beauty of Arena Club. AJ is going to send in and get the physical card sent to him. And you can do the same. 20% off your first slab pack or card purchase can happen for you if you go to arenaclub.com/foul and use the code FOUL.
So, Stephen, as we talked about, when it comes to the Braves, again, they have a 40-man roster. 5 players have been taken away. But that means that right now, there are still, yes, there's 5 open spots, but for a 40-man roster, you still got 46 players to account for. And let's go through these names real quickly that are on the 60-day IL. Because, Stephen, correct me if I'm wrong, even if a name that I mentioned that's on the 60-day IL will miss a significant to all part of next season, they can't be on the 60-day IL in the offseason. They have to be on the 40-man roster. So let's go through these names. Joe Jimenez, Austin Riley, Ozzie Albies, Aaron Bummer, Daysbel Hernandez, Grant Holmes, Renato Lopez, Spencer Swellenbach, AJ Smith-Shawver, Sean Murphy, and Austin Riley. Now, none of them are going anywhere, obviously. All 11 of those players are going to be back on the roster. So let's continue to make these decisions. Let's continue to identify how these roster spots are going to become open, because that's going to define some of the bigger storylines for the Braves in the offseason. Now, the first thing that stands out is that you're naturally going to have 2 or 3 spots come open when it comes to free agents. Raisel Iglesias, Marcelo Ozuna, that gets you to 8 spots. We'll have all offseason to discuss which one of those players could potentially come back to the Braves if they are re-signed. But, Stephen, that's one obvious way in which the Braves can clear more spots here in the near future.
Yep. So you got 11 guys, and like Sean just said, there's no 60-day IL in the offseason. So anybody who's on your roster has to be on your 40-man roster for the entirety of the offseason. And then I think the 60-day IL opens back up like the first week of spring training. And then you can put guys back on, and then you can open those 40-man spots back up. But for the entirety of the offseason, those players have to be on your 40-man roster. So that's why the Braves cleared 5 spots a couple of days ago. Again, they will clear 3 more spots when Charlie Morton, Marcelo Ozuna, and Raisel Iglesias hit free agency once the World Series ends. So that's 8 spots. So that still leaves 3 more spots they got to clear just to get the 11 guys back on from the 60-day IL. Now, again, they have plenty of options. Nick Allen, we'll see what happens. They did pick up Brett Wisely from the Giants, who can play shortstop. So right now they have Nick Allen, Vidal Brujan, they have Brett Wisely, and they have Hassan Kim. Now, if Hassan Kim opts out of his player option, then obviously he gets removed from the 40-man because he'll be a free agent, not on the Braves roster anymore. So that would kind of clear a spot. Now, the Braves are hoping that doesn't happen. Of course, they would much rather have him on the roster. If he does, if he declines his player option, or if he picks up his player option and is on the roster next year, then that means you would have Kim, Nick Allen, Vidal Brujan, and Brett Wisely all on the 40-man roster. I don't think you would. And of course, Ozzie Albies and Nacho Alvarez as well. That's six middle infielders on the 40-man roster. That's probably too many. If Hassan Kim accepts his player option and is on the team next year, Brett Wisely has minor league options. I'm guessing he stays, but Nick Allen and Vidal Brujan both do not have minor league options. So one, if not both of those guys, would certainly be on the line for being released, non-tendered, whatever, when the Braves need these spots. Do not be surprised at all if it's one of those guys. Again, on the outfield side, you've got, Jake, the Braves have Jake Fraley. He is technically on the 60-day IL right now. They can just bring him back. They can also just non-tender him if they don't think he's going to be. If the Braves want to upgrade outfield, and that's something that you and I and Scott and Brad have all talked about maybe using the DH spot on an outfielder, like a starting outfielder, and then you could have basically 4 starting outfielders and just let them rotate the DH. If that's the plan the Braves are interested in doing with, you can justify just non-tendering Jake Fraley because you're already going to have 4 high-profile outfielders, and then you could have, a guy like Eli White be your 5th outfielder. You probably don't need a guy as good as Jake Fraley to be your 5th outfielder. So certainly a guy like Jake Fraley. There's a guy named Carlos Rodriguez who's still on the 40-man roster, certainly could be bumped off. There's a catcher they picked up recently named Chucky Robinson. I'm sure he's a good player. He could get bumped off. And then there's always pitchers. I mean, I'll just go through it real quick. Nathan Wiles, Joey Wentz, Jose Suarez, Hunter Stratton, Joel Payamps, Roldy Munoz, Alex Manoah. Yeah, that's probably, I mean, even like a guy like Bryce Elder, Austin Cox, we'll see what happens with those guys. But like, just go reading through those names. All those names are currently on the 40-man roster. So there are plenty of places the Braves can go to cut off some dead weight here once they need these spots. But they're just going to have to do it. It is a administrative part of the offseason. They are going to have to cut at least 3 more guys off the roster just to get all of these 60-day IL guys back. And then that's before you even get into, if they want to add if they want to sign a free agent, if they want to make a trade, they're going to have to cut more guys off the 40-man roster because there is no 60-day IL in the offseason. All these guys have to be on the 40-man for the entirety of the offseason.
Well, and that's the important part of it because you went through all these names and they're significant, right? Because a lot of these names, you've got 2 or 3 candidates to fill important roles for the Braves: outfield depth, infield depth, reliever depth, rotation depth. And the big key is that we don't necessarily know for sure to what extent we're hoping the Braves are going to be, more aggressive when it comes to spending. But you also have to certainly think that they're going to be, conscientious of wanting to get good value from cheap sources. So making the right decisions to give you depth in those areas are what's going to be important. But with that being said, like you mentioned, who has minor league options and who does not? That will play into the factor. Who potentially is already into arbitration and could be offered more money. We saw the Braves make some, pretty eye-opening decisions, which seemed to be based off money last year. That could be what opens up these roster spots. So minor league options, how much are you owed? Things such as that. The versatility that you offer from your position, those type of things really come into play, and they're going to matter as the Braves continue to trim their roster to bring on players that are going to be with the Braves next year.
Yeah, and remember a couple of years ago, the Braves had kind of a 40-man roster crunch, and we saw the Aaron Bummer trade where they traded 4 guys who were all on the 40-man, who all were kind of dead weight to them at the time, and did a 4-for-1. And they went from 4 guys on the 40-man they didn't need to 1 guy on the 40-man that they wanted. So you can always do that as well. You can trade guys. A guy like Aaron Bummer, who is currently on the 60 IL, if teams are comfortable that he's healthy, that it would not surprise anybody if the Braves attempted to move him. There's plenty of ways to open up spots, and the Braves have plenty of dead weight on their roster that they could cut at any time and nobody would bat an eye. Players that most fans have never heard of. So it's not like it's some impossible task. It's just, it is part of the offseason. They do actually have to cut more players just to fit. I mean, had to have 11 guys on the 60-day IL when you get to the end of the season is pretty nuts. I'm not sure if I've ever seen, I certainly have never seen that with the Braves. I don't know if I've ever seen that with any roster. That's just an insane amount of guys on the 60-day. And so it's an unusual situation the Braves find themselves in where they're going to have to make a substantial amount of cuts even before the offseason begins just to get all their 60-day IL guys back on the 40-man. So just something to track, something to watch. We will get some roster news, in the next week or so, and certainly before the World Series ends, or at least 5 days after the World Series ends, to get this offseason started, just to get the roster where it needs to be.
Absolutely. And it's going to be really interesting to see what that looks like. Again, we're not even talking about, we're just talking about the Braves bringing back their players that we know are going to be on the roster. We haven't even gotten into opening up spots on the roster from potential offseason additions. So from on many different levels, in terms of many different, minor moves to major moves that can really, look to make the Braves future as awesome as it can be. We're in for what we hope is a very busy offseason. I know we said that last year, and it was a bit dull and a bit disappointing. This year, though, I think there's a better chance we'll really see, a lot of rocking and rolling when it comes to, filling out the Braves roster, and hopefully a roster that will be in a significantly better position to contend moving forward. Steven, anything else from you as we wrap up this edition of the Hammer Territory podcast?
Yes. We always forget to plug it, but we do have a merch shop. We have a website, hammerterritoryshop.com is where you can go. I'm a big tumbler guy. I like having, I always have a drink with me wherever I go. So I buy tumblers whenever I can. T-shirts, pullovers, hats, whatever your merch of choice is. Hammer Territory, there's Hammer Territory merch all over it. Anything you want. So all the sizes. There's a couple of Adidas pullovers in there. I have one of our Adidas pullovers, super nice material. It's obviously Adidas, so it's high quality. But yeah, we do have I always forget to mention, we have a merch shop. So if you want to support Hammer Territory, if you want some merch, hammerterritoryshop.com.
Make sure you check it out because there's so many great things to choose from for yourself or the ones that you love, whomever you would like to buy something for. Make sure you check it out and represent the official logo of your favorite Braves podcast and, hey, baseball podcast. There you go. hammerterritoryshop.com. That is all from us tonight. Again, nothing major, nothing groundbreaking or anything like that. We hope that there's plenty of that as the offseason goes along, but it's important to lay out what steps have to be taken first to make the space for those moves we all hope are coming as the offseason continues. You can find Stephen Tolbert at B_Outliers on Twitter/X. My name's Sean Coleman. You can find me at StatsSAC, Hammer Territory across all forms of social media, Foul Territory across all forms of social media, Hammer Territory, part of the Foul Territory family of podcasts. Can't thank you enough for joining us, and as always, the support. Enjoy the divisional round of the playoffs. Next week, me and Steven may give our picks when it comes to, after we have a bit more knowledge. We're going to cheat a little bit after we have a bit more knowledge of how the playoffs are going. Until next time, go Braves. We'll talk to you again soon here on the Hammer Territory podcast.